Welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations with artists, writers, and curators. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 47. Today's guest is Kevin Miyazaki. So, last episode I was being kind of mopey in the intro monologue about the fact that, that my kids are growing up, how there's no more babies in the house, and so this time around I was going to try to talk about something else, but then today was the first day of school for my kids, and the first day ever of preschool for my youngest, so, nope, that's pretty much where I am again. But seriously though, something I've been thinking about the past couple of days is beginnings and transitions and that specific anxiety of the first day in a new classroom. I think that's something that we all remember, or I don't know if I should say all of us, but certainly it's something that I remember from when I was a kid. That mixture of excitement and nervousness, not knowing what was going to happen on that first day. My older daughter started first grade today, and I think I was actually more nervous about it than she was, because when we saw the class lists that were posted last week, it looked like none of her friends from kindergarten were going to be in her class, and I didn't know how she would handle it. But, we didn't really make a big deal out of it. We just sort of mentioned the situation, but then focused on other stuff over the weekend. And then when she came home from school today, she had a good day. And I feel like there's something in there about what kinds of stories we make up in advance of things, and how if you let them, those narratives can make themselves happen, but how if you just sort of let things happen how they will, sometimes they work out, or at least they can work out differently from how you might have expected, or worried. And then that makes me think about what kind of a story we'll all tell about this year, once it's over, and when we get a year or 5 years, 10 years down the road, what'll be the thing that lasts in our memory, or what thing that maybe we didn't notice right away will turn out to have been important. I can never quite stay right in the moment when I think about my kids, or really about anything, I guess, but I'm always kind of looking ahead and wondering what the story will be. I don't know. I guess I'll find out, though. Actually, family and family narrative and family history is a pretty great segue into today's conversation, which is with Kevin Miyazaki. Kevin is an editorial and fine art photographer based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He's also the founder of Collect.give, which is a charitable online photo gallery, and of Tiny Tiny Group Show, which is an online group exhibition website. And we actually talked a little bit about both of those. I've been a fan of Kevin's work for some time now, and a lot of the work that he and I talked about for today's episode has to do with family history and identity and narrative, although often in Kevin's work the narrative is more sort of suggested or sometimes even hidden rather than being front and center. So there are 3 bodies of work that we mainly talked about in this conversation, one called Echo, one called The Sky Above, and one called Camp Home, and I put links to all of those in the show notes. We also mentioned his As Seen series and his book Yonsei. You can find both of those on his website as well, and I've linked that in the show notes. A couple other cool things to mention. Kevin was named one of the Critical Mass Top 50 for 2016, which, if you don't know what Critical Mass is, it's a pretty prestigious photo competition and award. I included a link to that 2016 Top 50 in the show notes. Also, images from Kevin's Camp Home series were recently included in an article on nationalgeographic.com, which paired images of his that are of buildings from the Tule Lake and Heart Mountain Japanese American internment camps with photos by Ansel Adams of the Manzanar internment camp. It's a really wonderful article, so do check that out. There's a link in the show notes for that as well. Anyway, as always, if you've got questions or comments as you're listening, you can use the hashtag ChannelOpenPod on Twitter to join in the conversation. And now here's my conversation with Kevin Miyazaki. So how you doing today?
I'm good. It's summer in Milwaukee, so that makes upper Midwestern people happy, and it's warm enough. Something you don't have to worry about, I suppose.
Yeah, well, San Diego, the thing in San Diego about the weather is that everybody always says it's 70 all the time, but in my part of San Diego, it gets sort of uncomfortably hot in the summer, but we deal with it. It's a fair trade for having mild winters, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's one of the things that I always do when I'm about to talk to somebody for the show is try and think of like, where did I first see this person's work or first become aware of this person? And it's like, for the life of me, I cannot remember where I first saw your work or became aware of you as an artist. Like, it almost kind of feels like I just have always known about you, and I I can't figure it out.
It's a microchip thing or something. Well, that's good. I guess that's good to know. I know from listening to other interviews and conversations you've had that Lens Scratch is a source for you a lot, and I agree. I think it's such a fantastic site.
Yeah. And I just went back and when as I was prepping to talk to you, I went back and it was it here or was it there? And I did notice, you were on there several times actually, and you did you were guest edited for them for the Wisconsin part of their state series. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Which was such a fun project to work on, and it's always nice to think about the artists in your neighborhood and your neck of the woods, and to call attention to everyone's work. So that was terrific to work on.
Yeah, one of the things I think is so fascinating about that whole sort of series that they have been doing is how you'd kind of get the impression almost if you weren't, I don't know, super educated, I guess, but like you'd think that in a certain geographic region that there might be a lot of similarity between what people are doing, and there can be, but what I always find fascinating is that in all of those little week-long mini-series that they do on each state, there's like a really wide breadth of what people are working on in each place, and I think that's so cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that whole project is such an indication of how wide and varied the photo community is. I mean, I think there are certain genres that we kind of think of, and sometimes it seems like everybody's doing sort of one thing, but of course they're not. And also the idea, I think that through social media, and there's just work that you see a lot of, and there's just so many people who maybe aren't self-promoting themselves in the same way, or haven't gotten the attention, and great work that's sort of just not necessarily being seen. Yeah. I mean, for me, the exciting part, but the hard part was to figure out who to talk about, because there's, I live in Milwaukee, and there's a really terrific photo community here in Milwaukee, and it's strong and vibrant, and so it was a fun idea to think of who I should feature, but then also kind of daunting because there's so many people to pick from.
Yeah, I was actually just thinking along those lines the other day, because I'm on Twitter probably more than I ought to be, and one of the things that often ends up coming up is you'll see a whole bunch of people retweeting something. It was like, oh, say what your top 5 this are, or your top 10 this are, and every time that kind of exercise comes up, I always think to myself, like yesterday it was somebody, the official Twitter account, so who are your top 5 people to follow, and I always think to myself, on the one hand, I want to say, because like there are these people that I think are great, but then I always get really sort of anxious about like, oh, what if I leave somebody out, and am I going to hurt somebody's feelings, or it's tough.
Right.
Yeah, and of course, something like art is always so there. Like you say, there is so much good work out there. That's something that I really think is. I actually really think we're living in a really great time for photography as art. I feel like there are these sort of crusty, old timers, whether or not they're actually chronologically old, but there are these people that kind of say, "Oh, things are terrible now, and they used to be better." But I really find right now there is just a really a wealth of great work out there. Do you find that as well?
Yeah, of course. I mean, you know, I think for most of us, we want our work that we're passionate and interested in to be seen by people.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, we could spend an hour just poking around the internet and find 25 new photographers that are interesting, So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I completely embrace sort of online platforms, social media, all that stuff. I think it's amazing. I want to look at pictures all day, and through Instagram and other things, I pretty much do,
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's fantastic. Like, I just see great stuff all the time. Sort of thinking along those lines of sort of a segue, I guess. You actually are involved with several different projects that you've sort of started, established, founded, whatever, that are sort of about giving space to other people. And I was one of them I didn't know about until the day before yesterday. And then one of them I have known about for a while was the one that I did know about was collect.give. And then the other one, which I guess is newer, is I can't remember exactly the name. Tiny Exhibition.
Yeah,
Is that
tiny group show.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and both of them are a little quiet now. Tiny group show. I'm actually working on one as well now. There's sort of never a timeline for it, but I used to be a pretty active blogger back in the day, and ended up meeting a lot of people through that sort of avenue. And I did these little things called tiny group shows, and basically they were just little collections of pictures on a topic, and I'd post them on my blog, and they were just screen grabs, historic photos, contemporary work, and I wasn't really, it was a little post, and I wasn't asking permission of Taryn Simon or somebody to put their image on this post, but I was just kind of doing it, and it was really fun and interesting for me, and I had some nice reaction on the blog. And so the site, after I stopped blogging, the site is basically that, and except I'm seeking permission from the artists, of course, now. And then there's also this element where there can be links to images that don't appear sort of on the site. So like there was. I did one show called Unreal, and it had people like Emily Scher and Wendell White, Kelly Connell, Diane Fox, just a lot of people whose work I admire and sort of fit into a theme. But then there was like the fake missile test picture that ran in the New York Times, links to things online, the Loch Ness Monster picture, so it might link to a Wikipedia site. So this kind of idea that an online exhibition doesn't have to just be, on a screen. It can take you and move you places. But it's fun. It's just very simple. It's usually about 20 images. They're broken up by a couple of lines, which feel a little bit like walls to me, but they're pretty much just very straightforward. And yeah, it's a really nice outlet for me just to be thinking about other people's work and themes. And yeah, I think I need to do it more regularly because it's actually kind of a lot of work. I mean, I find myself I'll have one subject matter, and then I'll keep finding things and adding names to this long list, and then sort of winnowing things down, and then reaching out to artists to see if I can use their image. And yeah, it's a very tiny little quiet project, but it's been really important to me.
Yeah, it's interesting when I've talked to like museum curators or people who will put together a physical exhibition. The way that often that they talk about building an exhibition, it seems to me to be very similar. The technique of it is sort of similar to how, as a photographer, we might put together, like sequence our own photo series. And I always find that really sort of fascinating, that, the curatorial process as a creative endeavor in and of itself. Do you find that?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because I think there's always these really nice connections in your head, to be made between two different artists that you like. But then the physical image too. I mean, because it's an online exhibition and it just kind of scrolls to the right, it's really straightforward. And so then those relationships of pictures together are really fantastic. And
Hmm.
or at least for me, I mean, that's kind of the fun part is what makes sense next to each other.
Hmm.
And yeah, which is I guess is the whole process of laying out a show within a gallery space or a museum space.
Hmm. With that actually sort of is another good segue, because the thinking about images next to each other, you're a lot of in your own work you use a lot of diptychs, it seems like, and it seems like you have sort of a fascination with images being in conversation with each other. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, I always have. I do, I do editorial work to make a living, but I've always sort of thought about, facing pages, and then in my artwork, the latest series that I've been working on called Echo, they are diptychs, and they sort of reference a photo album. The content is all about family, my personal family history. So they mimic pages next to each other. But yeah, I love the editing process. I love trying to find images that work and pair well together. I think I started as a newspaper photographer, and I think the editing. I think I'm a good editor of my work. Like I think that is a skill that. Technically, I learned like in a fast-paced environment, but you really needed to make decisions quickly
Hmm.
and determine what rises to the top in a short period of time. And I still edit that way for my editorial work. I'm really pretty quick, but it translates to artwork as well. Like I have very clear and kind of strong opinions about images I make, and then how they can work with other images in tandem. It's never been, and maybe that's bad. Maybe I'm overconfident, but I really trust that aspect of my decision making, and so it doesn't. It's never a struggle. It comes pretty easily, at least that part of it.
Hmm. Yeah, it is. I think a lot of times artists tend to, I don't know, like when you say you might be overconfident, I find that artists are almost always like, if they're anything too much, it's in the opposite direction. It's like not
Right.
not not feeling like they're good at stuff. There's a sort of like a baseline insecurity and anxiety that almost all the artists I know seem to have.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. I mean, but there is some element in there. I think that having the way my path of photography was from photojournalism first and newspaper work, and then into editorial work, I think there is sort of this confidence that you have to have in your decisions when it comes to that kind of work, and I think so that has translated to some degree.
Yeah, yeah,
I have
yeah.
plenty of other things that I'm not secure about.
One of the things that I really enjoy about the way that you use diptychs in a lot of your work, and I was going through a bunch of your series over the last few days just to sort of brush up, and is how like a lot of these. Well, first of all, I feel like a lot of your work is sort of very graphic in nature, and I mean that in sort of a design sense, not necessarily in terms of like graphic content, but just what it looks like. Often, your compositions and uses of color have a very, they seem very design influenced. And so when you pair these images with each other, like one might be more graphic looking and one more naturalistic looking, or often there's a way that compositionally the two images might mirror each other, but it sets up this really interesting, like you can't help but think about the sort of thematic comparisons that when you have those two images next to each other, they might be next to each other. What am I trying to say? It's. I think it's a tricky thing to do, to find images that that look good next to each other, whether it's because they're similar or because they contrast, and then doing that in a way that sort of supports the thematic elements of the series that you're working in. That's a tricky thing. It is a skill, and I don't think it's something that everybody does well.
Yeah, I think. I mean, I do have a degree in graphic design. That's what I studied in college, and I did photography the whole time. I mean, the idea was that I was going to be a photographer, but graphic design was my second choice. So, yeah, I mean, I think design does play really a big part in the way I look at making pictures, whether it's editorial work or artwork. I think there's a very sort of straightforward and flat way that I look at things. But the pairings for Echo, it's interesting because they're all pictures that relate to my family history. They're either old, like, family archival pictures, new pictures I've made, or some pictures from other series. What I've done with Echo is it has become this big library of pictures that can all be used in tandem with other images. So I'll be going to Hawaii next week for a funeral of a relative, and so while I'm there, I'll make pictures. And the pictures I'm making are mostly just kind of small. They're not really grand pictures. I don't set out to make any on any given day, but when I'm in Hawaii or if I happen to be in Japan, the pictures are, they come pretty quickly. But the pairings, as far as family history goes, they're not linear. They're not even different. Some are from sides of my father's family. Some are my mother's family. So they're a real jumble within that context, and that's sort of important to the project because when I started making this work, I had just done a piece for a group show about identity, and I had created a slideshow, and it was very simple. It was like an old-fashioned slideshow on the wall, and it was 60 pages from my grandmother's photo album from the 1920s. And I'd never met my grandmother, but one of my uncles has this album. So once when I was with him, I shot every page. And so the slideshow was just her album. And in looking at those pages, it was really kind of wonderful because, I became really interested in the whole concept of the family album. And, here's this book that contains, first of all, just beautiful images, snapshots, and things that I found just, aesthetically just kind of amazing. But there's information in there. There's pictures of my grandmother when she's a young woman traveling to Japan on a steamer ship. So there's sort of fact. And then there's unknown. There's people that I have no idea who they are, and it's not labeled on the back of the photo or on the page. There are missing pictures. There's pages where there are just no pictures, and you can see that things have been torn out. And so, this idea of the family album is a sort of a historic document, but it also contains mystery, unknown things, maybe things that will be taken factually incorrectly. So it's this complicated sort of object and vehicle. So in making Echo and creating these diptychs, again mimicking those sort of the pages of an album, I like that idea that this is all about my family, but if someone were to look at it from a content point of view, it's my mother's brother in one image and it's my father's niece in another image. There's no real strong timeline or actually even link to connect the pictures. So it all makes sense to me, but almost to hardly anybody else, if that makes sense. No,
it does. It's interesting. I connected with this series and several of your other series on a real personal level myself. Both of us are, Japanese Americans, but many generations removed from the immigrant generation. And so there was a lot for me that was very resonant on a deeply personal level. But on a more sort of artistic level, one of the things that I found really interesting about this series, but also several of your other series, is I think the same is true of your As Seen series, of your Sky Above series, that in many of these images, that there's a sort of suggestion of a narrative. Like you look at this picture and you're like, there's a story to this picture. You just sort of viscerally know that there's a story behind these pictures, but it's only suggested and it's never made explicit. So the narrative remains kind of hidden, and it kind of seems like purposefully hidden. If and I find that really an interesting artistic choice. You know, like the you mentioned the sense of mystery, and I think that there is that, like anybody who goes and looks through an old family album that, you know, that isn't one that is their own family album, like you always wonder a little bit, and there's something kind of exciting about that wondering, and I find that there's something, a similar quality to that in many of your bodies of work.
I like that. I mean, I like that that's something that you've taken away from looking at the work. The Sky Above series, I mean, I think, the idea of like the suggestion of a narrative that's unclear, it's really exactly that, right? So in that series, I'm actually in places that are important in my family history. It could be the hospital where my sister was born, or the first house that my parents owned. And rather than look at the actual location, the built landscape, I'm just pointing the camera up to the sky and making an image. And so, you know, the idea is that I'm actually there, I'm present in a place, but it's really not about how the building has aged or what's replaced the hospital and is now, you know, a gas station or something. It's really not about that. It's just about me being there, being present. But as you say, everything else is sort of suggested. I'm not describing what it looks like. I'm just saying I was there. And even the sky is, you know, it's out of focus, and it's as basically as an open slate as can be. But I also, the idea about the sky is that it's, you know, it's both always changing, right? So it would never be the same image in different locations, but it also looks the way it would have looked in 1941 when my father, you know, left his house in Tacoma. You know, the sky above that house, you know, would have also been the sky now. So there's you know, I think that's an interesting vehicle, and they're very simple pictures. I mean, I think, you know, that series for me is a lot about just being in those places. And of course I take a picture of his childhood home, but it's more important to me, for me to sort of mark this this idea that I was there, I was present.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's an interesting thing because photography is, you know, traditionally so much about sort of representing a thing, and it's about, like, we talk about capturing an image. It's always so much about what's in the frame, and in many cases it feels like, you know, in that series especially, but not just that series, that a lot of times in your photographs, that the really important part of it is actually outside the frame, but you know, there either in that series, it's, you know, you're that's suggested mainly through the artist statement, but in other ones it's suggested by the image itself. I find that really a fascinating, that you're able to suggest these things is pretty awesome.
Well, I appreciate that thought. I mean, I don't know. You know, the basic idea that that artwork should raise questions, right? Is I don't know. I think that's sort of paramount to what we do. I think if images are too straightforward, that's probably kind of I don't know.
Yeah. Well, so you know, as I mentioned before, you know, I connected with several of your series on a really deep, sort of personal, visceral kind of level, and the one that really sort of hit me emotionally the hardest was Camp Home. And this, so you're looking at buildings from the Tule Lake and Heart Mountain internment camps that were later repurposed to be, you know, taken out of those camps and repurposed to be people's barns or their own other people's homes, which is something I first of all had no idea had happened. So just from a historical context, like that was kind of shocking to me in a way. I mean, I really just had no idea. But the internment, I think for every Japanese American family who was around at that time, I cannot imagine that does not form a huge sort of, as a part of your family history, of all of our family histories, that remains significant, 70, almost 80 years later. It's something that still feels very present in a lot of ways. Do you find that? I mean, you must. You're making work about it.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it's always relevant, right? I mean, it's topical, unfortunately, which is both, I guess, a good thing that that we can think about these issues, but it's also sad that we have to revisit, the types of racism and whatnot that that comes from it. But what can I ask? What generation are you? Yonsei?
On the longest path, I'm actually Gosei.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I'm actually only 3/4 Japanese, so like I have one white grandparent, and my mom is half, and her mom is actually was I guess sort of a war bride.
Okay.
But then on my dad's side, we've been here for a really long time. My dad's family came over in like the 1880s, 1890s. Mm-hmm. So, and they settled in Monterey County, mostly in Salinas, and most of them are actually still there. So we have very deep roots in that area. Nice. And there's a very long-standing Japanese American community in the city of Salinas, California. Mostly an agricultural community. But I've always found it really, well, I guess between Camp Home and then your Yonsei book, which, I mean, I guess I should probably, just because this is for listeners too, is just sort of explain what that even means.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, it feels like we're just talking here, but...
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, Yonsei is means fourth generation, and we count the generations, the first generation being the immigrant generation. Right. But your Yonsei book and Camp Home, there's something I think I find is about diasporic communities in general, and I think this is very true of Asian American and Japanese American communities, particularly, that as we get farther and farther from the generation that came here, that there is this sort of longing for a connection that, especially if, like, because I also grew up in a very white community, and which is something that you pointed out in several of your artist statements, growing up in the Midwest in very white communities, that you don't necessarily have a connection to a broader Asian identity growing up. And I feel like when we get older, that's something that a lot of us have this sense of longing for. And I feel that in some of your work.
Yeah, no, it's there. I mean, I think and I should say, so I grew up in suburban Milwaukee, and actually even locating here is a result of the camp. After the internment camps, my family on my dad's side decided to come to the Midwest and not go back to Tacoma. So that's even sort of part of how I grew up here. My mom is from Hawaii, and she came as a young teacher and decided to stay in the Midwest. So I have a lot of family in Hawaii as well. But no, I really, I mean, I had a pretty amazing childhood here. I sort of love the community that I grew up in. I find myself back in the same area as an adult by choice. And so, yeah, I mean, but I also was always the only person of color in a room, in a classroom. back in those days, the high school was, really high majority of white students, and it was sort of my norm, right? I mean, it's just kind of what I knew, and then I would go to Hawaii for a family reunion and be surrounded by 150 Japanese faces, and that's where I felt less comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of that is underlying a lot of my work, but the idea, and so I feel like it's sort of a bad Japanese, right? Like I don't speak Japanese.
God, yeah.
I don't, and I listened to, I forget who you were talking to, but I listened to one of your conversations with another artist, and you had mentioned that you had reservations about going to Japan because you don't speak the language. And for a long time, I had the exact same thing. I mean,
Yeah.
I would
have
say
trouble
that,
even just going to the Japanese market sometimes because I get so anxious that people are going to try to speak to me in Japanese.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely true. So but I've gotten over that, and I think you should get to Japan as soon as you can because it was great, and what I do know how to say in Japanese is Nihongo wakarimasen, which means I don't speak Japanese.
Yeah.
So I kind of blurt that out very quickly, but no. I think you're right about that being sort of this underlying theme of I'm sort of like grasping at anything that's related to my own personal ethnicity and the family history, and I mean, as far as it being an inspiration to make work, I mean, I just can't get enough of it. I mean, I just old family pictures. Historic things about the internment, all of that is just, I can't get enough of it. It's exactly what I want to make work about with sort of blinders in a large way because it never it never stops holding my interest. So and then there's just such a wealth of things to dig into. We're having at this funeral in Hawaii is on my mom's side, but on her father's side there'll be a little small family reunion, so I'm gathering all these old archival pictures that I have to do a slideshow, and I don't know, I can't get enough of it, and so that I feel like as long as I'm making work, it'll all come back to that. There's still a lot for me to mine and different ways for it to sort of find itself in the world.
Yeah. I think there's something about family history that, I mean, I feel like in general, I can't speak with a lot of authority about other Asian cultures because obviously we're not all the same, but I do feel like there's something very Japanese about having an interest in family history, but it takes on a sort of different quality for, sort of multi-generational diasporic Japanese people, that there's this desire to be rooted in something. That's how it manifests for me, I think, a lot. And a lot of my work, I haven't felt maybe brave enough, I guess, to make work that's explicitly about identity yet, but I feel like I'm sort of working myself up to it, if that makes sense. Do you feel like that was something? Because I was looking at the chronology of the work that you have on your website. It seems like the more identity-oriented or ethnically oriented work is on the newer side. Is that something that you had to sort of work up to as well?
I think so. I mean, I've really only been making artwork in a serious way since about 2000, really. The plus side about starting off doing photojournalism and newspaper work when I was younger is that from a skill set point of view, you learn things really quickly, and I don't know if I was really fit for that work. I did it for about 10 years, but it also teaches you, assignment work is problem solving, like graphic design is, right? So you have this set of circumstances, and you're plopped into it, and you make, the best pictures you can make, and you do your job, and that's very different from art making. So, in school, I had taken some art classes, and really enjoyed like printmaking and drawing. I was never good at it, but I've kind of liked all those processes, and I always liked the idea of making art. But when I was a newspaper photographer, I would sort of like dabble in it a little bit, and it was just terrible. And because my mindset was really different, and so almost after newspaper work, I worked on the staff of a city magazine in Cincinnati. And it was sort of a transition, but I was still doing the same kind of assignment work in general. And I swear, after I stopped that, the artwork actually just came pretty quickly. And I still do, a lot of assignment work and still problem solved and that kind of work. But I've found that balance. But I forget what your question was. I started rambling here.
No. I guess what I was just, I have. For myself, and then I know that, talking to other artists of color, this is not a universal thing, but it has been a common thing where there's a sort of, I find that with people's earlier work, oftentimes they want not to make work that's about race or ethnicity or identity. They want to not sort of be stereotyped that way, I guess. There's a reluctance because you don't want to be the person who well, I make racial work, you want to be sort of more general purpose, I guess, or not put in a box. But that a lot of us feel a compulsion to get there eventually because it does form such a big part of our experience, and experience obviously is what underlies all artistic expression. And so you can't not go there.
I think you're right. Even, if I look at my sort of upbringing and my childhood, again, very happy. I was a very sort of outgoing person in school, and a lot of that was, when I think about it later, is actually sort of a reaction against my ethnicity. I kind of, my brother, who's older than me, was, I really followed his sort of personality in a lot of ways, sort of class clownish and, kind of very, very I was never going to be the person sitting quietly in the back of the room. I wanted to rather be leading a conversation. But, when I think about that now, it's a fairly clear, if I was laying on a couch of a therapist, it's probably pretty clear that that's a reaction against, the stereotypes of my ethnicity and wanting to be seen. So I think it is underlying all of that. And like you said, eventually you sort of come to that and it all sort of makes sense in this big circle, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It is. It's such a strange experience to, a lot of what you're saying feels very familiar to me. The thing about, growing up, I very similarly had an upbringing that was in a very Caucasian town, and I didn't have very many. This being California, we always had Latino people in our schools, but there were very few Asian people and almost no black people, and growing up, I didn't at the time mostly think of it in these terms. I just sort of felt oh, my friends are my friends, and the fact that they're all white people, it didn't seem weird at the time. And I got a lot of, I had a lot of experiences with racism as a kid, but also I still felt like that was where I belonged, So, and it wasn't until sort of later in life that I sort of was able to articulate the feeling of belonging to a place, but not belonging in that place. And it was something that I really had to spend a lot. I had to have, I think, a little more life experience before I was able to put that to express that in any kind of clear way, even to myself.
Right, yeah. Right. But even those, because I've thought about similar things, but even those kind of ideas of, in our case, it's not like displacement because this is where maybe we were born and raised. But this idea of outsider and even location and physical space and whatnot. I mean, I think that all factors into all these stories, that have come before. I think, when I've visited the Tule Lake and Hard Mountain camps, I mean, the thing that's really present in my mind, which I think is probably common for people that visit there, are what was it like to first arrive there, right? I mean, you're completely displaced from your home and you're brought to this location, right? And what did that initial feeling, how did that feel to members of my family? So, I think it's sort of this thread that runs throughout. And in our case, it's not it wasn't a traumatic thing for me to grow up in suburban Milwaukee, but am I out of place to some degree? I guess you can say maybe most Americans have that, right? I mean, I should say this about the echo work, I mean, it's like so personal, right? I mean, every image relates really strongly and directly to my family, but the goal with that work ultimately is that it's this sort of American immigration story, right? So there are pictures within the work that I think even if you weren't Japanese American, if you weren't interested in your family history, that I hope still sparks interest or people can relate to in some way, because it's about patterns of migration, it's about generations, it's about things that are very universal and in many ways very American. The pictures have this content that's kind of very Asian feeling, but I mean, a steamer ship picture in an album, there's many steamer ship pictures in albums of Irish Americans, and so I think and hope that there's always ways for people to also relate to this work.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's the whole thing about art, right? That it's a form of communication, and I think what's really great about the art that always ends up meaning the most to me, and I've said this like over and over again on the show, but is the art that lets you, feel like you're connecting with someone else's experience in a way that still feels familiar. And so, for me, looking at this work, I mean, basically all of it feels familiar to me and resonant in that way. But it is sort of in my mind that, like, somebody who doesn't have this exact experience could still, the way that this functions to sort of invite people into that experience is really valuable. I always, oh gosh, somebody I was talking to said something to the effect of that art is like a machine for generating empathy, and we really need more of that. I feel like right now especially.
Yeah. Need some big machines of empathy, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, why don't we take a little break, and then we'll come back and do the second segment. So for the second segment, I always ask the guest to bring a topic of their own, which can be anything that you'd like to talk about, anything you find interesting or that you've been thinking about recently. So what would you like to talk about today?
Well, so this year I turned 50. I got my AARP notice in the mail like a few days after turning 50. They're very organized, those folks. But so I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about aging and ageism and creativity. I don't know that I have a lot to say right away, but it's been in the back of my mind quite a bit, I guess that's for sure.
Yeah.
One of the reasons is that not too long ago I was at an art opening, and there were lots of young artists there, and this is not to criticize anybody involved, but and an older local artist walked in, and you could just really feel this sort of divided energy in the room. Not any sort of adversarial thing, but there just seems to be this idea or something that happens, and I've noticed it in sort of larger photo community gatherings where, maybe older artists maybe are dismissed, and I don't know that I can really put a real fine handle on it, but that idea that maybe that there's less respect for people that are making work, and maybe that's kind of a photography thing too. But and getting back to this idea of Japanese culture, where you're sort of revered and respected as you get older. I kind of like that. Kind of worries me as a person who's aging. Also, I mean, I don't know. You're younger than I am.
Yeah, I am, but I'm not that young. And even, I just turned 38, so I am younger than you. But, it does seem like, in every way, like in basically every aspect, there's of our culture, there is a real fascination with youth, real reverence for youth and youth culture, which on some level I actually find really energizing. In oftentimes I being able to participate in things that young people find interesting, and that when young people are, because I have a lot of friends who are still in their 20s, or some of them are even in their young 20s. But also, there's always another 30 under 30 list that I'm like, well, okay, I'm never going to be on that list now. So it is sort of a strange thing. And you don't want to be the like crusty old guy who's like, oh, kids these days, or,
Right.
but there is an aspect of, of exclusion there, or there can be. Yeah.
I think there can be. I mean, I do some teaching here in Milwaukee, so I feel like to some degree I'm sort of connected to younger artists and what they're thinking about and whatnot. But I gave a talk about my work about a year ago, and the audience, it was a big audience, and it was an art survey class. So there were artists in the class, but I think there were non-art students anyway. But everyone was in their kind of early 20s, and I closed after talking about what I do and my inspiration, all this stuff. I kind of closed by talking about age and just saying that I think something that people don't tell you, or you're not sort of really clued into when you're a young creative person, is that like I'm 50, but I feel like I'm a better photographer than I've ever been. I have more interesting art ideas than I've ever had, and there is no. I mean, there doesn't need to be any kind of slowing of your creative process. In fact, you bring more skill sets to it the longer you're doing these kinds of things. So I don't know. I don't know that at 22 I would have thought, oh, I'm going to be I'm going to have really good ideas when I'm 55. And but I'm sort of embracing it. Maybe I'm a little fearful also. That's why I've been thinking about it. But I kind of feel like this creative life is a long one, right? And and I don't feel like I'm aging creatively, right? I don't feel like I'm diminishing because of age, and maybe this idea of ageism. I mean, I think ageism completely exists, but maybe I'm thinking about it because I'm worried that it's to be directed at me at some point.
Yeah, it is sort of an odd thing. I also feel like the older I've gotten, the sort of the more depth my work has gotten, and I don't see any reason why that ought to change. A big part of it for me is just that I mean, I didn't really start making art in a serious way until I was maybe about 30-ish, maybe a little older. Which at the time felt like I was really old. But just looking around and seeing it, all of these like kids that were fresh out of their MFAs, like having solo shows in New York, and I don't know, and I was just sort of, rinky-dinking around, with my own website, but but there's something the thing that I keep thinking to myself is that the work that I'm making now, whether it's writing or photography or whatever, there's no way that I could have made this as a younger person because I hadn't lived enough life yet. Which on one level is like I almost can't understand how some young people are able to make work that's like because there are young people making really amazing work, and I'm just like, but you're like you have hardly even lived. Like what this is I don't understand how you do this, but yeah, I don't know. I feel like not being an artist for the first 30 years of my life is what allowed me to have enough experiences to even contemplate, that I couldn't have done any, like I wouldn't have had anything to say when I was 20.
Right. Right. Well, I certainly think there are, that trajectory is so different by the individual, right? But I agree. I mean, you're building up life experience and, but also, I mean, I think in some cases you're like, we have this similar background where I was making photography, but also I was in sort of a different genre. So like it was different than artwork, right?
Mm-hmm.
And your work as an engineer is different from artwork. And, that's a pull, that's a lot of your mental energy in your occupation, right? That you have to sort of pull away from in the other direction to make work. And I don't think that's a small thing. I mean, I think that's probably a hard thing.
It can be. Yeah, it can be. And mostly, for me, the main thing is just having enough time and energy. Because sometimes when I get home, I'm just like, I just want to sit down. I'm done for the day.
Yeah, that's amazing. And then you have a family too, right? So
yeah.
I don't have kids, so that's amazing.
They don't let you sit down. My youngest just turned 3, and she's very 3. She's great.
Well, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to loop it back around because it's brought something else to mind. This idea that I love Instagram. I've been on it for a few years now, but I had to sort of be talked into it by some good photography pals. But it's really important to me now. Like I have 2 feeds. I have like one for my my commercial food work, and then one that's really personal. But this kind of comes back around because one of the reasons why I really I find it important. It's a little bit like when I had the blog, I was making pictures that, again, coming from this assignment background that really had no, I had no real reason to make them. The idea of always being asked to make pictures for something means that, if you're a newspaper photographer, you can drive by, the prettiest little, picture in the world, but if it's not going to be in your newspaper, like you just keep going, and that's pretty kind of dangerous. I'm not saying everybody in that field does that, but that's kind of how I was functioning. And so when I was doing the blog, I would just make pictures, and I liked them, and I put them on the blog, and there was like a place for them, right? There was like a home. So Instagram functions that way for me too now, where it's like, it can be a reflection in a puddle, right? And I might take a picture of it. And so the idea for me there too is that like when we both of us and the greater photography world, like I think a similarity is that most likely when we all started taking pictures, it's very open-minded, right? I mean, you like physically are holding this camera and looking around, like, what can I take a picture of, right? I mean, that's sort of how people start photography, or at least maybe they used to. Maybe everything's different now with the phone, but this idea of being really open-minded and what am I going to find aesthetically pleasing, and just like pointing your camera and trying things.
Yeah.
So Instagram for me, I think it's really important for photographers to not lose that kind of spark, right? Like to not like self-edit visually just because it doesn't fit into the big project that I'm working on, right? So I think it's good creatively. It's like, it's a visual exercise maybe, but I kind of, as a photographer, I kind of hope like I never lose just that feeling of oh, isn't that a great picture? You know, I want to capture that.
Yeah.
And so Instagram, you know, it really has nothing to do with my artwork, except I also find it really important, and I like it, and I love making pictures in that vein. But it's also keeps me like open-minded, right? And just you know, a peeling paint on a barn wall is not off limits if I want to make that picture, right? And
Yeah.
I think it's dangerous to sort of say, I'm not going to take a picture of a red barn wall because, you know, that's cheesy. But anyway, I
Yeah.
kind of looped around. But I think that, you know, that source of like photography as just a spark within all of us, like I want to hopefully hold on to that. And that's a way that I feel like I can do that.
Yeah. For me, I mean, I'm just basically constantly, sometimes to the annoyance of my wife and the other people around me, just constantly sort of taking pictures in my mind. Like I'll see something and, you know, oh, look at that. Wouldn't that be a great picture? And I can't even help it. And it's funny because a lot of the sort of more official work that I've done, my official sort of art series, it came about from me just shooting instinctually and then realizing after the fact that I was actually making something on a theme, and I actually have a really hard time making work to a concept. Like I've done some commercial work, you know, shooting family portraits and weddings and stuff like that, and I actually really enjoy it. There's an aspect of it where I feel like I can just sort of engage the sort of, like you say, the problem solving part of it, but also just sort of shooting without thinking about, you know, what is this going to be for?
Right.
But when I'm working, when I'm thinking like I want to make a picture about X, then it just doesn't happen. It's like,
but that's okay. That's your
Yeah.
process, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
But I mean, I think that's where something like Instagram, okay, I have a series of photographs now that I made a little artist book out of, that just started with me just sort of tinkering around on Instagram because I was bored at my job, you know, and then I realized, oh, wait a second, if I take all of these pictures and string them together, there's like 100 of them, and I didn't use all 100 of them, but you know, this is like 2 years worth of mornings right here, so that actually means something.
Nice.
And yeah, there is something like I feel like there's a, you know, to sort of bring it back to the concept of aging. I was thinking about this as you were talking. There is sort of a danger of as you get more established in a working process, of abandoning the sort of spontaneity that you have when you're young.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you know, when I'm thinking about sort of a lot of the younger artists that I see, some of whom I really enjoy their work, but especially the ones that are coming out of MFA programs, oftentimes there can be a sense when I'm looking at these pictures that like these pictures were made because the person wanted to make pictures and was looking for something to make pictures about, rather than the work that often really speaks to me is like, this is something that this person is interested in, and they're using the photographs as a medium of a way of exploring that thing rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I feel like there is a way that spontaneity can be lost whether you're young or old, if that makes sense. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree. I mean, I think if we start with things that we're deeply interested in, you know, in your case, family, in my case, family, in maybe a slightly different way, I don't know. The work will all come out, right?
Yeah.
It'll all come out of our head somehow. I'm starting to do some work that's non-photographic now, which I've never really done before, but or object-based, and even some sort of physical making of things, and it's, you know, it's a totally different avenue for me. I'm not really sure how good the work is, but, you know, I just kind of have to make it, so I'm doing it.
I find actually that's one of the ways that I sort of end up keeping fresh is that, like I started getting really into book arts a couple years ago, and it also sort of happened by accident where it was like it almost happened because I was procrastinating on a photographic project, and so I started just as a way of distracting myself or not thinking about the work that I was trying to do. I was just procrastinating by looking up bookmaking techniques, and then I ended up making 3 books.
Nice.
But there's something about, when you can find yourself trying something new in that way and coming at it as a complete beginner, that does sort of spark a similar sense of exploration that you had at the beginning of your main discipline. I find, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, you got to hold on to that. I mean, that spark is what started it all for all of us, right? So you get too far away from it, and I just love making pictures. Not interesting editorial assignment or whatever. I'm still making pictures, right? So I kind of feel like, that's a good day when somebody's going to pay me to do something like that. But you make more as an engineer than I do as a freelance editorial photographer.
Oh, well,
that's good.
I'm less interested in it, though. So I guess there's a trade-off. I shouldn't complain. Sometimes I feel like, he's complaining about making a good living. Like, what an asshole. So,
but it's good to have the resources then to do what you want to do, also, right?
Yeah, it's true. It definitely is true. So I guess we've been going. It's been over an hour now, so we should probably finish. But there's one last question that I like to ask everybody before we close, and that is whether there is a piece of art or literature or just general creativity that you've seen recently, that you've experienced recently, that meant something to you.
Yeah, there's several things, but the one that I'd love to mention, I'll try to do this briefly, but there's a really interesting show at the Milwaukee Art Museum right now by an artist named Paul Druka, who's a local artist. And he started 20 years ago a project called the Social Event Archive, where he asked people to give him snapshots that represented some kind of social event. And so 1997, he started this process. And my partner at the time, she had donated one, and I think he got 700 some pictures into this archive. And so the art museum, Lisa Sutcliffe is a photography curator at the Milwaukee Art Museum, and so she put on this exhibition 20 years after he started, and it's fascinating. It's I think they displayed about 600 or so. I don't think it's all of them, but they wrap around the really large photography galleries in the museum, and they're just small snapshots. And it's really it's almost kind of easy to dismiss, I think, if you were somebody just visiting the museum and maybe weren't that interested in art or photography or something, because it's kind of physically like each picture, they're snapshots. They look like I came to your house and I took a picture from one of your photo albums. But it's really, I think it's so interesting that this is being displayed now, and this idea that snapshot and personal photography has changed so much since 1997. And Paul, as an artist that's interested in sort of social issues and society and at large and whatnot, I don't know if having the foresight's the right way to say it, because that's what he was interested in at the time, and he couldn't have known maybe the way photography would change. But to think about what it means now to take a picture of some of these same things. There's a lot of like birthday cakes and there's graduations and that kind of thing. To think about how those pictures are being made now, and just the difference in the way the craft has changed is what I really took away. And so it's pretty fascinating exhibition, actually.
That sounds cool. I wish I lived closer.
I don't know what the museum website has online, but But anyway, it's very, especially maybe for the photography community, it's pretty fascinating to think about, you know, technology is part of what we do and science and all this stuff, and so our craft and the tools have changed a lot. But you know, people are still having birthday parties and they're still graduating. They're still taking those pictures, but you know, the act of them being little 4x6 prints is not really the same.
Yeah. All right. Well, cool. Thanks so much. Yeah, I had a really great time talking to you. So thanks.
Yeah, Mike. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks for what you're doing for the photo community, because I think the you know, just having this forum is really it's pretty fabulous. I've listened to quite a few of the interviews now, and yeah, it's a nice thing that you're giving back.
Oh, thank you so much. Okay, so as I mentioned beforehand, do go check out the Critical Mass Top 50 and Kevin's feature in Nat Geo. There are links to both of those in the show notes. And that is our show. Now, normally at this point, I'd be asking you to leave a review or donate to the show, something like that. But today, I'm going to change it up and ask for something different. Now, as you probably all know, Houston has been devastated by Hurricane Harvey, and they can use all the help that they can get. So instead of doing something for me or for the show, please take a minute and if you can, donate to help the victims of the hurricanes. I've included a special section in the show notes with a list of local organizations in the Houston area that can use your support. So if you can, please take a minute and help. Okay, so just to finish up, our theme music is by Poddington Bear. You can find more of his music available for licensing at soundofpicture.com. Next time our guest will be writer Celeste Ng, so be sure to come back for that. Until then, remember, keep the channel open.